Okay, Sully's on the couch and ready to go, and that wasn't an earthquake. That was Scout jumping down onto the table where the computer is, of course. And y'all are ready, and I'm ready. And today we're going to talk about Andrew Johnson. Now, he became president right after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated because he was the vice president. This was the first time that we had ever had in the United States a president who was assassinated, or I think even who had died at that point during the term of their office, and the vice president stepped in and took over for him. So let's look at Andrew Johnson, and spoiler alert, he's kind of a jerk, but let's look at him anyway. He was born December the 29th in 1808 in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was the younger of two sons, and his parents' names were Jacob and Mary Johnson. Now, Jacob, his father, worked at the local inn. He was some sort of an official in the Presbyterian church that they went to, and he was the town constable. But he died when Andrew was only 3. And at that point, if you were a woman with children and your husband died and you didn't have other family or independent wealth that you hadn't been left to you, you couldn't get a job. You were basically left in poverty. So what she ended up doing was taking in spinning and weaving. She would make cloth and thread for people and to sell. And that's how she helped to support her family. Later, she did remarry. When Andrew was 14, and he didn't go to school much, his mother taught him how to read, and then he just learned to continue to learn to read on his own. But I guess they were helping out in the family, and they didn't go to school. There were not the same kind of laws that there are now, so he just didn't go to school. When he was 14, there's Sully. He has decided to join us today. When Andrew was 14, his mother sent him to be an apprentice to a tailor to learn how to make clothing. And this was going to be a decent job. Bless you. And in 1826, just about the time he turned 17, he and his family moved to Greenville, Tennessee. He opened his own tailor shop and apparently did fairly well for himself. Eventually, now this was the one thing I thought about him that was kind of cool, because I like to listen to audiobooks. If you know me, you've seen me listening to audiobooks. He hired a man to sit in his tailor shop and read books to him while he was working sewing clothing. Because he hadn't been to school, and so a lot of the things that he had the guy read to him were books of famous speeches and the Constitution. He had him read to him about the Constitution, and eventually he learned the Constitution to the point where he could recite it from memory, pretty much all of it. There were probably some of it that he couldn't, but in a large part he could recite the Constitution from memory, which is, I couldn't do that. When he turned 18 in 1827, he married 16-year-old Eliza McCardle, and she became Eliza Johnson. Her father was a shoemaker. She taught Andrew to read and write more fluently and to be able to do math, because apparently he hadn't learned how to do that. And so she would often read to him while he was working. Later on, as she became older, she caught the disease tuberculosis, what they called slow consumption in those days. It's a disease that attacks your lungs, and at that point was generally always fatal. Now we have drugs that will clear that up. One of my own uncles had tuberculosis at one point. He was in the Army and he served in Iraq, and he got tuberculosis, took all of his medication, and it was fine. But she was very ill, and so at the time when he was president, she did not fulfill a lot of the role of First Lady. His oldest daughter, Martha, who was the wife of the U.S. Senator from Tennessee, whose name was David Patterson, she kind of filled in for her mom and, was the hostess for all of the things that needed to be done as the First Lady, because Eliza was too ill. Johnson's lack of formal education made him popular with the people who were poorer in Tennessee. Remember, Tennessee is a southern state. It's going to have a plantation economy. Lots of the people that were in charge of things in that state were very wealthy and owned a lot of slaves. Johnson was not one of those people. Eventually, he did get to the point where he owned a few slaves, but he was never a very wealthy person. And so he appealed to the people who were of working class and not wealthy. Before he was 21, he had organized the Working Man's Party, and they elected him an alderman and then the mayor of the city of Greenville, Tennessee. He was sent to the state legislature and served 8 years from 1835 to 1843 and became part of the Democratic Party. He also then was elected a U.S. representative, again from 1843 to 1853. And after that, he served as the governor of Tennessee from 1853 to 1857. So he's kind of becoming extremely political and being fairly successful at this point. After he was governor of Tennessee, he was elected a U.S. senator in 1856, and he generally adhered to the dominant Democratic views. He favored lower tariffs. He opposed the anti-slavery agitation. He was in favor of slavery. He didn't believe it should be outlawed. And he, as I said, he even owned a few slaves himself. But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected, and the southern states lost their minds and immediately decided that they needed to secede from the Union. But Andrew Johnson did not believe in secession. He was violently opposed to the southern states leaving. He refused to join the Confederacy, and he actually stayed in Washington at his post as a senator. He did not care anything at all about freeing the Black people, but he kind of wanted to get even with and do away with the aristocrats and the very wealthy people in the South, the white people in the South. He didn't care about the Black people having equal rights at all, or even freedom at all. He was appointed by Lincoln in May of 1862 as the military governor of Tennessee, which was by then under federal control. When it was time for Lincoln's reelection in 1864, he was trying to broaden his base of support within the Democratic Party, because there were Democrats in the North as well. And he selected Andrew Johnson to run as his vice president. Johnson's first appearance in public on the national stage went really badly. Apparently, he was recovering from an illness on Inauguration Day. And so one of the things that you did to recover from illness at that point, they didn't have great medicine, was that you drank some whiskey. And apparently he drank a little more than he should have. And so he was swaying on his feet and he was stumbling over his words. He almost fell down a couple of times. He very much embarrassed his colleagues. And the northern newspapers just were appalled at this. Later, people would use this to declare him of being a drunk, but I can't find any evidence that he appeared in public as a drunk any other point. He may have been, but I can't find any, I didn't see any evidence of it. Admittedly, this was a kind of a quick dive into this, but I didn't see that as being written as one of his defining qualities. Less than 5 weeks after he became the vice president, he was the president. And now he's got to deal with the Reconstruction, the aftermath of the Civil War, bringing the Confederate States back into the Union, rebuilding, reconstructing the Union. The congressional Republicans, who were the radical Republicans, which means, you've got your Republicans at this point were on the right, and these were the really far right ones. They favored severe measures against the South. They wanted to punish the South for seceding in the first place. And Lincoln had wanted to use a more lenient approach. He didn't want to try to punish the South. He wanted to kind of just, okay, that's over. We're going to move forward, a more lenient approach. And Johnson wanted to follow that approach. But Johnson didn't want to make any real efforts to protect the people who had been slaves before and are now free. And they don't really have a place in society at this point. And he didn't care if they ever had a place in society, to be honest. Like I said, kind of a jerk. Congress was outraged by the fact that the South, since they were not being punished, were basically saying, well, okay, we're just going to set everything back up the exact way it was. And okay, yeah, we don't still own these Black people, but they began passing what they called Black codes, which were special laws to keep Black people from being able to own property, from being able to go to school, from being able to, basically, they were going to fix it so these people were still pretty much slaves. They just didn't get to be called slaves anymore. And the US Congress was not having it. And so they were very angry about this and refused to allow the people who had been elected into the Senate and into the House of Representatives to be seated, because they were like, no, this is not what we wanted when we won this war. We're not having it. So they set up what they called the Joint Committee of 15 on Reconstruction. Johnson was not happy with this because he thought this was a usurpation, a taking of power from the executive branch and giving it to the congressional branch. Remember, we have a separation of state. No, we have separation of powers and checks and balances. And no one branch is supposed to have more power than the other. And he thought this was giving the legislative branch, the Congress, too much power. And so he refused to support them. One of the things he was really upset about was that one of the first things the Congress passed was the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of, what year was it, 1866, which guaranteed Southern Black people the right to vote, Black men at this point only, the right to vote. It did not give the right to vote to the Black people in the North, only in the South. And Johnson was not going to have that. He believed that putting power over whites into the hands of former slaves would create problems, and the white people were not going to have it. And so he vetoed that piece of legislation and the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau bill. And Congress came back and passed both of those bills over his veto. Remember, if they have enough senators and House of Representative people that want to vote for this bill, they can pass it over a veto. This was the first time in history that had ever been done. Up until this point, 1866, no Congress had ever passed something over a president's veto. They did it twice right here. And also, Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship to anyone who was born in this country or who was naturalized into this country, regardless of what race or ethnicity they were. Johnson did not support this. He didn't think that Black people should get to be citizens. And so he fought against this, but he lost, and the amendment was ratified. In the congressional elections of 1866, Johnson made an 18-day tour of the Midwest, which he called the Swing Around the Circle, to explain and defend his policies and to defeat congressional candidates who were opposing him. So he was going out making speeches to get his drum up support for his way of thinking. Didn't do real well with it. His speeches were often just he was heckled by lots of people. He had a bad temper. He became very ill-tempered and would yell at people, and it didn't go well. In Indianapolis, Indiana, there was actually a confrontation with the crowd, and it erupted into violence, and at least one person was killed. The result was the radical Republicans swept all of the elections and had a huge majority in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So that was it. Johnson wasn't going to get anything passed. Anything that he vetoed, if they wanted it badly enough, they could override his veto. In March of 1867, the Congress passed, over Johnson's veto, the first of the Reconstruction Acts, which provided suffrage for male freedmen in military administration of the southern states. And Johnson tried to delay these acts, but he could not stop them. So basically, at this point, he was constantly antagonizing the Senate and the House of Representatives, and he and the Republicans had pretty much become sworn enemies. One of the things that they passed in March of 1867 also was called the Tenure of Office Act, which said that the chief executive could not remove, without the Senate's permission, federal officers whose appointments had originally been made with the advice and consent of the Senate. So he couldn't replace like members of his cabinet without the Senate's permission. And they just did this because they pretty much hated Johnson, and they didn't want him getting rid of the people that Lincoln had appointed. And it was just another way to show him, look, dude, you think you're the boss, but you're not the boss. We're the bosses. And he did not support this. Johnson didn't. And so he went right on ahead and dismissed Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton from office. And Stanton was a radical Republican. And Johnson did this so that he could test the constitutionality of this act. In response to this, the House of Representatives voted articles of impeachment against the president. This was the first time a president had been impeached. And it's kind of, the president can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors against the country. Basically, this was like they were just fighting over who got to be in charge. And that's not really a high crime or a misdemeanor. Now, Johnson was a jerk. But was this really an impeachable offense? I'm not sure that it was. So they have the impeachment, and then they have a trial. In the trial takes place in the Senate. It was presided over by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His name was Salmon P. Chase. The charges were very weak. And despite all of the passion with which they were argued, when they took the two key votes, May the 16th and May the 26th of 1868, they were one vote short of the 2/3 that they needed to convict him. 7 Republicans voted with Johnson's supporters, and that kept him from being convicted. Those 7 men had had huge amounts of pressure put on them to vote to convict, and they did not. And none of those senators that voted to acquit President Johnson ever was reelected to an office. When Johnson was brought the message that the Senate had failed to convict him, he wept and declared that he would devote the remainder of his life to restoring his reputation. In spite of the fact that he was not convicted, his usefulness as a national leader was over. He had no power to get anything done at this point. Basically, during the remainder of his tenure, he granted amnesty to a lot of the former rebel leaders. He refused to support the passage of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote to all men, regardless of what color or religion, what color or race they were. Sorry, religion got something else altogether. That was not ratified until the next administration, which was Ulysses S Grant. And in 1868, he was not nominated to run for office again, and he didn't actually try to get the nomination. He returned home to Tennessee. He ran a couple of times to be a senator again. He was defeated, but in 1875, he was reelected to the Senate, and shortly before he died, he was reelected to Senate. He died on July the 31st of 1875, so I'm not sure he ever actually even took his seat. He died of a stroke while he was visiting his daughter in Tennessee near a town called Carter Station. It's said that he was buried with a copy of the Constitution because that was what he considered to be the most important. Now, interestingly, in 1926, in the case of Myers versus the United States, the Supreme Court handed down an opinion on the president's power to remove officials from office that, in effect, vindicated the position that Andrew Johnson had taken and declared the Tenure of Office Act unconstitutional. So he was right about that, but he was wrong about a whole lot of things. So that's all I have for you about Andrew Johnson. I was kind of interested in the fact that he was apparently an adopter of audiobooks, but other than that, I didn't find him very likable. What did you think? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe. Share this video if you liked it. Let me know what you thought. Let me know what you'd like me to talk about. I think that's everything I have for you. I've got cats roaming around on the ground down here like sharks floating around in the water, rubbing up against my leg. It's a little disconcerting. So I'm going to let you all go. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. All right, Sully, we're done.